Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Atlantic Council Front Page event. I'm Halima Croft, Board Director at the Atlantic Council and Head of Global Commodity Strategy and MENA Research at RBC Capital Markets. AC Front Page is the Atlantic Council's premier platform for world leaders to engage in dialogue and share solutions to address global challenges. In that spirit, we are delighted to welcome United States Senator, the Honorable Chris Murphy of Connecticut, to discuss the future of democratic foreign policy. This event is held in partnership with RBC Capital Markets as part of the Atlantic Council's bipartisan election year event series, Election 2024, America's Role in the World. This series aims to offer clarity and elevate discussions on how the 2024 U.S. presidential and congressional elections will impact America's foreign policy, fulfilling our mission of providing an essential forum for navigating the economic, political, and technological changes defining the 21st century and of shaping the global future together. We invite you to stay tuned for future events in this series, and we will feature both Democrat and Republican voices on the future of U.S. foreign policy. Over the past 10 years, the United States has worked with allies and partners to build and uphold a rules-based international system. Now it faces major challenges across the globe, from authoritarian adversaries seeking to undermine democracy, economic turbulence, and shifting global markets, to significant opportunities posed by technological advancements. In the run-up to November, it is vital that the American public and global citizens consider the foreign policy platforms of candidates, including how the United States should conceptualize its role in the world, position itself to counter competitors, and build a free and stable, prosperous world. Senator Chris Murphy joins us to share his thoughts on the core foreign policy issues the next president will face and what a potential Harris presidency will mean for foreign policy. Senator Murphy has served in the United States Senate for over a decade and is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations and Senate Appropriations Committee, where he has worked to provide a forward-thinking foreign policy vision for the United States. He carries a genuine belief in U.S. leadership on the global stage and in the power of diplomacy. Senator Murphy himself noted, "It is dangerous to not talk to your enemies. Discussions and negotiations are a way to ease tensions and reduce the chances for a crisis." Sir, we very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on the future of democratic foreign policy. We are honored to have Kaylee Lentz moderating the conversation. Kaylee is a Washington correspondent from Bloomberg and co-hosts Bloomberg's Balance of Power. She previously worked at Bloomberg's New York headquarters, covering major macro and the intersection of policy and markets. Before I turn it over to her, a couple of housekeeping events. The event is public and on the record. Towards the end of our moderated conversation with Senator Murphy, we will take some questions from the audience. For those joining virtually and in person, please submit your questions to askac.org, displayed on the screen now, and don't forget to include your name and affiliation. Thank you again for joining us, and Kaylee, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Senator. Great to see you.
Great to be here.
Looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah.
Obviously, on the eve of what is going to be a very, very big night for both candidates, in which they probably aren't going to be able to dodge foreign policy questions. So let's just start 30,000 feet. What is at stake, not just for the United States, but for a global world order in this presidential election?
Well, Kaylee, great to be here with you. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting and for all of the work that you do to help educate and inform members of the United States Senate. Listen, I don't think this is going to be a foreign policy election. Let's just be honest about that. Well, Americans are clearly paying attention to what's happening in the Middle East, to the war in Ukraine. They are much more concerned right now about the health of their democracy, the ins and outs of their kitchen table economic conversation, how much they're paying, how much they're making. They're concerned about their kids' schools and the safety of their neighborhoods. But that being said, there couldn't be a bigger gulf between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris when it comes to how they are going to protect us in this world. Now, the vice president clearly is going to have a significant degree of continuity Obviously, she deeply supports Ukraine's ability to defend itself and believes if Russia wins that war, it has enormous implications for America's security and the security of Europe. She believes in democracy and human rights. She's going to continue to push an agenda that seeks space for people to be able to contest dictators and autocrats around the world. I think to the extent that there's anything new that comes from a Harris administration, and there will be new priorities, she is, as a younger chief executive, going to care about the real sort of future threats 50 years out, 60 years out to the United States. So you will likely see a Harris administration paying attention to how we work with our allies and perhaps our adversaries to regulate AI. Climate change will be a priority. She'll pay attention to these massive youth poverty bulges that threaten global instability in places like Africa. Donald Trump is and will be a daily threat to U.S. national security. First and foremost, because his foreign policy will be deeply corrupt. Since he left office, his family has become more deeply entangled in the global financial system, deeper relationships financially, the Trump family personally, with autocrats, with countries that have deep and important interests with the United States. Trump will do what he tried to do in his first term, this time actually shattering alliances. I don't think we can trust that NATO will still be around at the end of a Trump presidency. He will form alliances with autocrats and dictators who model the kind of illiberal democracy that he seeks to bring to the United States. He's a climate denier. He will do nothing to carry on the Biden administration's work of trying to make sure America walks the walk and talks the talk on climate change. And once again, America will be the laughingstock of the global community. Joe Biden had to do a lot of hard work to restore our image and our respect around the world. It feels like it was a long time ago when Trump was standing up before the United Nations getting laughed at, literally laughed at by the global community. Once again, the United States will be a pariah at a moment where it is more important than ever before that we seek and deepen our alliances. So, while the voters may not be coming to the polls this fall with foreign policy as their number one issue, the difference between the two candidates is just enormous.
Well, and as you suggest that Donald Trump would be a daily threat to U.S. national security, nearly half the electorate still supports him all the same. Do you think the isolationist that is the candidate is reflective of a more isolationist American electorate?
Well, I think, as I said, that Americans are not necessarily looking at the differences on foreign policy when they're evaluating the candidates. But let's be honest, the American foreign policy establishment has made a bunch of very big mistakes. Americans do have questions about the war in Ukraine, in large part because in the past, when the American foreign policy establishment tells voters that it is in the vital U.S. national security interest to commit resources abroad, whether that was Iraq, whether that was Syria, whether that was the last 10 years of Afghanistan, they end up being wrong. And so there is a hangover, that still in some ways lingers from Vietnam, but certainly exists based upon the mistakes we made in the Middle East over the course of the last 10 years, which causes the American public to question the wisdom of any recommendation that's being given on committing U.S. resources or troops overseas. So I do think all of us who care deeply about the United States helping Ukraine have to do a better job of explaining why that's different, why a nation state seeking to expand its borders by invading a neighboring country threatens to upend the global order in a way that requires the United States to be part of that fight. But yes, there is a skepticism amongst the American public in entangling the United States in military endeavors overseas. And I think Kamala Harris is someone who has been skeptical of American military commitment in the Middle East, in a way is perfectly positioned to be able to explain to the American public why, for instance, Ukraine matters, but why we should be reluctant to put ourselves in another position like we did in Iraq or in the back end of the engagement in Afghanistan.
Well, Senator, I'm glad you raised that because, of course, the House Foreign Affairs Committee has just released a new report on the Afghanistan withdrawal. That was more than 3 years ago. You've seen it, sir?
I have not. No.
Okay. Well,
I have not read it.
It includes accusations that the Biden administration lied about what was taking place in Afghanistan, and of course blames Vice President Harris a bit more, and or at least includes her more than in previous reports. Do you think there is any fairness in suggestions that the chaotic nature of that withdrawal has shaped the conflicts that have erupted around the world in the 3 years in the following up to now?
No. To the contrary, in fact. Had the United States remained mired in Afghanistan in an open-ended way, we would have been distracted from the hard work we needed to do to be able to build a global coalition that has repelled Russia inside Ukraine, that has frustrated every single one of Russia's ambitions. Russia thought they'd be in Kyiv within a month. They thought they would shatter Europe. They thought they would weaken NATO. None of that has come true. We were able to build that coalition. The Biden administration was able to do that in part because we weren't committed to a war in Afghanistan where we were not making progress. Similarly, our work to try to confront the rise of China, to build a new global coalition to make sure that China doesn't end up dominating the rules of the new economic order, that work was possible, again, because we were not mired in the Afghan conflict. Everybody needs to remember that the document that committed the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan was not signed or initiated by Joe Biden. It was signed and initiated by Donald Trump. In fact, he put us on an unrealistic timeline for withdrawal that tied the hands of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And let's also be honest, nobody could have predicted the overnight disintegration of the Afghan military and Afghan government. Once that was set in motion, I don't think there's any way for there not to be some level of disorder and chaos around that withdrawal. Joe Biden did the best job he could in managing a withdrawal timeline set by Donald Trump that was deeply unrealistic and flawed. In the long run, I think it was really important for U.S. national security interests for the United States to divest itself from the Afghanistan conflict. And I frankly think that there's not much of an appetite in the American public for an argument that we should still be there. The act of withdrawing from Afghanistan was a difficult one, but it was one that was supported by the American public.
But do you identify any mistakes that were made that a future President Harris or any future president would want to avoid in conflicts in the future?
I mean, listen, I think anybody involved in that operation with the benefit of hindsight, right, would say, of course, had we known that the Afghan government was going to disappear overnight, we would have started withdrawing our people much earlier. The reason that the Biden administration decided to wait was to try to prevent that very collapse that ended up happening. So I think it's difficult to do Monday morning quarterbacking on some aspects of foreign policy. I think the Biden administration made the right choices. I don't think they could have predicted the way that the Afghan government abandoned the country. Once that happened, there was really no way for there not to be elements of the withdrawal that were going to be a mess. And listen, I and all of us deeply regret the loss of life, first and foremost Americans, but many Afghans who died during the withdrawal and died thereafter. But unfortunately, there are sometimes some pretty awful costs that come with very quick emergency circumstance departures like we saw in and around Kabul.
I'd like to stay in the Middle East as well for a moment, as obviously one of the fissures within your party is over Israel and the ongoing war in Gaza. We have seen domestic pressure on the Netanyahu government increasing in recent weeks, especially in the aftermath of the killing of 6 hostages that were being held by Hamas. Is it your expectation that a ceasefire is something the current administration is going to realize, or will it be up to the next president ultimately?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. Obviously, we have been waiting with bated breath for an announcement of a ceasefire for months, and every day that we don't achieve it, it feels less likely. I think it's very difficult given the fact that for both the Israeli government, Netanyahu's government, and for Hamas, there is political upside in not signing a ceasefire. For Netanyahu, his coalition simply may not stand for a ceasefire deal. Certainly a ceasefire deal that involves any kind of release of Hamas prisoners, and Netanyahu's hold on power may ultimately be dependent on him not signing that ceasefire agreement. Similarly, Hamas feels like it's continuing to grow global support by holding out. I wish that weren't the case, but there is some truth to it. So I want a ceasefire deal. I wish it were able to happen yesterday, but my worry is that both the Netanyahu government and Hamas may not see it in their political interest to deliver that by election day. There's been some writing about Netanyahu's opinions about the U.S. election. Obviously this is speculative, but it is not hard to believe that Netanyahu is rooting for Trump to win. It is not hard to believe that Netanyahu may not want to deliver any kind of diplomatic victory to the Biden administration in the weeks leading up to the election. I hope that is not the case. I hope that Netanyahu's decisions are rooted only in what's right for Israel and regional security, but I don't think you have to be deeply cynical to believe that he may be making decisions that in part to affect U.S. political dynamics.
Do you think Netanyahu has reason to be more wary of a future president, Kamala Harris? Do you actually see daylight between the vice president and the president on the issue of Israel? Have you seen evidence of that? Because it does seem that voters seem to think that she will be more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, perhaps draw a harder line than the president has done.
Well, she has not articulated, any difference between her position or a future position and the president's position. That would likely be unwise given the fact that she is still vice president at a moment of crisis in the Middle East. But listen, Benjamin Netanyahu personally, probably does have something to lose from an American administration that cares most about Israel's security, not Benjamin Netanyahu's personal political security. So what we are seeking to do on a daily basis is set in order a ceasefire and hostage release deal that is good for the people of Israel, good for regional security, and ultimately good for the United States. That is a different calculation than what is good for Benjamin Netanyahu politically, somebody who needs to stay in power, potentially to stay out of legal trouble. So I don't think any American leader should ever make a decision based upon what's good for the personal political prospects of any foreign leader. In this case, we should be thinking every single day about what's good for our sacred ally, the country of Israel.
Well, and as you talk about regional security, that obviously includes the question of Iran, not just proxies like Hamas or even Hezbollah, but Iran itself. There have been plenty of accusations, I've heard many from your colleagues in the Senate on the Republican side, that this administration has been too soft on Iran. Do you see any future administration needing to change tact when it comes to the handling of that adversary in particular?
Well, I've heard those criticisms as well.
I'm sure you have, sir.
But let's be absolutely clear. There are more sanctions levied against Iran today than under the Trump administration. The Biden administration inherited the sanctions that were put in place by the Trump administration and have added to those sanctions. There were many of us, frankly, who advised the administration in those early days to unilaterally re-enter the nuclear agreement. President Biden decided he would not do that without new commitments from the Iranian regime, commitments that they were not willing to make. I think at this moment, when we are, literally just weeks away from Iran sending missiles and drones to try to kill innocent Israelis, we have to be engaged in a very serious effort to show the Iranian regime that there are consequences. And that's what the administration has been doing. Listen, you've got a new government in Iran. Down the line, at some point, could there be an opportunity to have a dialogue? Possibly. I would never rule out that at some point there might be a benefit to the United States in sitting down and talking to an adversary, but this is not that moment right now. In the wake of the way that Iran is supporting, funding, and arming all of these very dangerous militia groups and proxy groups in the region, we need to be dealing with them very strongly and harshly.
Before we move on to another area of the world, I do want to remind our audience that is watching at askac.org. You can submit questions for the senator, but I do have some more on a conflict you've mentioned a few times already. That's the ongoing war in Ukraine. We understand that in just a few weeks' time at the UN General Assembly, Zelensky would like to present President Biden with a plan to force Russia to end the war. That may include diplomacy, it may include economic measures. Do you really think we're at that point yet in which there could be an end scene to this conflict, or is the next president still going to be dealing with it?
My guess is that the next president will still be dealing with this conflict, in part because Vladimir Putin's calculation on whether to seek an end to the war is likely completely dependent on the outcome of this election. Donald Trump is going to hand Ukraine to Vladimir Putin.
So you think that's what Trump means when he says he can end the war in one day?
100%. So Donald Trump is going to end this war in a way that ultimately allows Putin to win. Putin knows that. Donald Trump has signaled that in the affectionate way that he continues to talk about the Russian leader, in his general disdain for democratic norms here in the United States and across the globe. So if I'm Putin, I just wait until this election is over. And if Donald Trump wins, then I'll have confidence that I'll be able to sit down at the negotiating table with Donald Trump and have Ukraine handed to me on a silver platter. Obviously, you saw Donald Trump lead the fight to end U.S. support for Ukraine, right? That didn't happen quietly. That didn't happen privately. That happened in the open. Trump has made it clear if he's president, he will cut support off for Ukraine. If America cuts support off for Ukraine, there is no way for Ukraine to survive. If Kamala Harris wins, the world will see that the United States is going to continue to support and defend Ukraine. And then knowing that he's in for a long fight, he has a much greater incentive to sit down and do a deal that ultimately respects the sovereignty of Ukraine. Obviously, Putin would need something in that agreement. That will be up to the Ukrainian leadership as to what to give him, but that negotiation likely is only real in a way that protects Ukraine if Kamala Harris is president.
Well, even if she's president, if she doesn't get both chambers of Congress along with her, if you don't stay in the Senate majority and if the House doesn't flip, do you see difficulty in getting funding for Ukraine across the finish line? Because as we all remember well, it was not easy this last go around.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be a fool to say anything other than of course. I mean, we saw how difficult it was to just get the Speaker of the House to call up a vote, knowing that he had a very big bipartisan majority for Ukraine. Now, the prospective Senate Republican leaders, have been strong supporters of Ukraine funding. But yes, if Republicans are in charge of the House and the Senate, that makes things a lot tougher for Ukraine. This is a scary moment right now where the Republican Party has no interest in defending democracy abroad. They live in this naive world of neo-appeasement in which they hope that Putin will just stop at Ukraine, like some leaders in the United States hoped that Hitler would stop in Eastern Europe. The reality is Putin very well may not stop. It will also signal President Xi that he has a permission slip to go into Taiwan and perhaps other countries in which he has territorial ambitions. The lid could come off overnight, the post-World War II global economic and political order, if we lose Ukraine. And it is just very scary to me that Republicans don't see that.
You mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation this idea that Donald Trump may not be abiding by the articles of NATO. He might want out of it altogether. Do you really believe that? And won't there be checks on that from Congress if, as you say, there are still even Republican majorities who are supportive of Ukraine and do believe in this notion that it is vital, not just for the security of Europe, but for this broad ideal of democracy around the world?
It's a good question because there are new checks on the president's ability to withdraw us from NATO. In fact, as a prophylactic against a future Trump administration, Congress, in a bipartisan way, this last Congress passed legislation that requires congressional consent to withdraw from NATO. But as you also know, even if we remain in NATO, a simple signaling that the United States may not be there to make good on our Article 5 promise is an invitation to somebody like Vladimir Putin to test the security of our borders. I think we underestimate how it was personnel surrounding President Trump that helped keep some of his worst national security ambitions in check during his first term. General Kelly's not going to be there in the second term. Rex Tillerson isn't going to be there. Mike Pompeo isn't going to even be there. The people that are going to be running the national security apparatus are going to be sycophants of Donald Trump, are going to be people whose ideas are actually more radical than Trump's ideas are, people who may actually be in office to do exactly what Donald Trump is trying to do, to monetize their position at the State Department or the National Security Council for themselves. I think it's hard to understand how potentially dystopian American national security will be in term 2 if you've got 25-year-old MAGA enthusiasts running the National Security Council rather than the quasi-establishment Republicans that were able to remain in some national security senior roles during Trump's first administration.
So if all of this contributes to what you see as Vladimir Putin likely wanting a second Trump administration, especially in light of what the DOJ has released in recent weeks, internet domains and those who have been propagating misinformation in part that the DOJ alleges is intended to influence the outcome of the election. How concerned should we be about mis and disinformation being propagated, not just from the Russian government, but others as well?
Yeah, I don't think we need to say Putin likely wants Trump to win. I mean, we have all the evidence in front of us, as you mentioned, this recent uncovering of a deep integration between the Russian state and the MAGA media world to know that Putin wants Trump to win. And of course, that stands to reason because Trump has made it clear to the world that if he wins, he will stop supporting Ukraine. So you don't even have to find the hidden evidence of Russia's integration with Trump's media ecosystem to know that, of course, Putin is going to desire the candidate who is going to withdraw from the Ukraine fight. But what we did learn last week was pretty stunning. Though the company is not named in the charging documents, everybody knows what this company is. The company's name is Tenet. It employs a host of very high-profile Trump supporters. They were deeply in business with the Russian state, receiving millions of dollars of Russian money in order to propagate Russian propaganda under the guise of MAGA advocacy, and it may be just the tip of the iceberg. This is one major MAGA media company, one major Trump media company that had been infiltrated and funded by the Russian government. It is likely that that is not the end of the buy-up of the MAGA information infrastructure by the Russian state.
There's also concern about what can be propagated on platforms like TikTok and the influence of China specifically. So that's where I'd like to go next. Do you think that is as great a threat to the American election? Who would China prefer win? Is it as obvious to you?
I think it is still pretty obvious, right? Because ultimately, China wants a lot of things, but in their heart, they deeply want Taiwan. And they see very clearly that there is no chance that Trump will defend Taiwan in the way that he has telegraphed that he will not help Ukraine defend itself. So I don't think there's a question that if Taiwan is the priority of the Chinese regime, that they would prefer a Trump presidency. China is no doubt trying to influence our elections. Iran is trying to influence our elections. Russia, as we already spoken of, is trying to influence our elections. It speaks to the need to be able to stand up a real robust domestic defense. I'm glad the Biden administration is taking this seriously, but I wish it were something that both Democrats and Republicans cared about. I wish my Republican colleagues cared about defending our elections from foreign influence. It just doesn't seem to be something they care as much about, I guess, because they see that they might be getting the benefit from that influence.
On Taiwan, obviously, Donald Trump has suggested to my colleagues at Bloomberg Businessweek that Taiwan might need to pay for its own security. Joe Biden has been a little bit more forthcoming about coming to the defense of Taiwan if it proved necessary, which raises the question as to whether or not one China is still the policy of strategic ambiguity, is still strategically ambiguous, or are we starting to see a shift? Does there need to be a shift in a future Democratic presidency?
I think our policy has served us well. We don't have a security treaty relationship with Taiwan in the way that we have with our NATO allies, but everyone knows we have a deep and abiding interest in Taiwan's sovereignty and independence, and the world has seen how the Biden administration has significantly stepped up its defense, political, and economic integration with the government of Taiwan. But there is a difference between our security relationship with Taiwan and our security relationship with other allies. It is also true that Taiwan does have an obligation to increase its defense spending. If I was the government of Taiwan, I would probably be spending a lot more as a percentage of GDP than they are on domestic defenses. So Taiwan needs to do more. The United States can continue to do more. And of course, we hold open the possibility that if China were to try to take Taiwan by force, that the United States would be there to defend Taiwan. Ultimately, we are a democracy, right? So the only people that get to make the decision as to whether we enter a war overseas are the American people. And so that's important for everybody to know, that no president, whether it be Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, or Donald Trump, can commit the armed forces to defend anyone overseas without the consent of the American people. There will be a vote in Congress, and depending on the circumstances of the moment, it very well may be that the American people will decide that defending Taiwan is in the deep and abiding security interest of the American people.
Well, and of course, Congress, it's one of the few areas in which it seems you and Republican colleagues have bipartisan agreement is on being hawkish on China and competing with China as best the U.S. can. Obviously, a lot of that has been reflected in things like chips, for example. We've seen this administration putting in export controls on strategic technology. Do you see a need for that to be ramped up even further? How should the U.S. looking forward be approaching this strategic competition with China?
Let's explore that question for the premise for a second. It is true that right now there is a mainstream position inside the Republican Party to abandon Ukraine. It is true that there's not as much support for NATO as there used to be, but there are still large numbers of Republicans that support aid to Ukraine. There's still large numbers of Republicans that support NATO. And so we still have a big bipartisan majority coalition in the House and the Senate for mainstream elements of President Biden's foreign policy, whether it be support for Israel, whether it be support for NATO, whether it be support for Ukraine. It's certainly worrying that Trump is trying to unwind that bipartisan commitment, but I want to give credit to Republicans who have stuck with those important priorities. The answer to your question is yes, of course. We have woken up far too late to the mistake we made under Democratic and Republican administrations, Democratic and Republican Congresses for decades, to believe that integrating China into the world economic order would best protect American workers, would best protect American national security interests, and would best advance the cause of democracy and human rights inside China. It did none of those things. It hurt American workers, it compromised American national security interests, and it just allowed for the Chinese regime to get all of the benefits of economic integration while continuing to squash domestic dissent. Now, I don't think we are going to decouple ourselves completely from China. I think that would be unrealistic and probably a bad decision from a national security perspective. We do want to have some economic dependence on each other. But when it comes to strategic industries, yes, we have to build a capability either in the United States or between the United States and our democratic allies to be able to make sure that we can produce critical minerals, critical medicines, critical high technology products in the United States or in countries that we have firm, rock-solid, permanent alliances with.
So you specifically say not decoupling. This administration has been very careful to talk about diversifying or friendshoring,
Right.
not saying decoupling. Donald Trump, of course, is proposing potentially up to 60% tariffs on all goods coming from China. But when you consider this economic relationship, are tariffs an appropriate tool to be using? Should Democrats, obviously including this administration, which have kept intact a lot of the tariffs from the first Trump administration, should those continue to be deployed? Do they need to be elevated?
Yes. No, tariffs are a completely legitimate and very important and effective tool. Now, I think for a long time we looked at tariff and trade policy as a way to try to convince China to behave differently. I think it is pretty clear that China is on a committed and uncontested path, that they are going to continue to cheat, they're going to continue to steal intellectual property, they are going to continue to dump products on the international market. So today, tariffs and trade policy are probably more effectively used in order to give advantage and to bolster domestic industries. I think the Biden administration have used them effectively when it comes to the electric vehicle industry. China is not going to stop dumping electric vehicles and battery technology on the international market. So we have to build our own industry in the United States, and the tariffs that the Biden administration have imposed will help us build that industry. But you've got to use tariff policy in a thoughtful way. And every single credible economist has made it perfectly clear that Trump's tariff proposal will simply result in an immediate, unaffordable tax increase on the American public. It's true, tariffs will often have an impact on domestic prices. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. But that's why you use them carefully, so as not to have a cost of living shock in the United States, which is what you will have if Trump's policy goes into effect. Overnight, prices in the United States across every single commodity and industry will go up 20, 30, 40% in some instances. That's not the responsible way to use tariff policy. What Biden has been doing, using tariffs in a more targeted, thoughtful way, is the way to do it.
Well, of course, Biden is only going to be president for a few more months, and then it will be up to the next president to deal with these issues, including something that has it seems, taken the escalator to the forefront of thought, artificial intelligence. This relates to China as well. Some of those export controls I was talking about are aimed at curbing their ability to develop that technology as well. How does the U.S. need to be thinking about being competitive in AI, and what guardrails need to come with it at the same time that we try to achieve heights with it?
Well, I think to the topic at hand, what's the future of American foreign policy, specifically under a Harris administration? I hesitate to do much prediction, but I do think that, as a next generation leader, a President Harris is going to be thinking about these 30, 40, 50-year challenges to international security like AI. So I think the first commitment we need to make is to our own people. I think China delights as the United States refuses to regulate social media and AI. I think they are watching America potentially destroy a generation of children. And we have this conversation in the United States from AI regulation skeptics who say, oh, well, we can't regulate AI because that'll give China an advantage. I think that is a ridiculous position to take, because if we're to leave AI and social media unregulated, it could be the undoing of our own democracy. There may not be a democracy left in the United States with which to use to contest China's rise in the world. So I think our first obligation is to make sure that we protect our own citizens. And then I think the second priority is to link arms with Europe and our democratic allies. I think if we were going to set a series of rules for how different AI systems are unleashed on consumer markets, it'd be better to do that with the Europeans. Ultimately, maybe there is a role to have a conversation with China on this topic, right? Now does not seem to be the moment. I think we're better off first coming to some consensus with Europe on guardrails for the build out of AI. But once we are linked, once we are together, maybe that gives us strength in a conversation with China.
If you don't think we're there at cooperating on AI yet, are there areas of cooperation you see potential with China on climate, for example, or others?
I think there's still a potential for cooperation on climate. I think the only way that any country, China included, will take us seriously on any climate negotiations is if the United States doesn't just talk the talk but walks the walk. So putting into effect the Inflation Reduction Act, which will likely reduce climate emissions from this country by 40% by 2035, is absolutely critical. We know that Donald Trump, as a climate denier, is going to erase climate advocacy from our national security policy. But if Kamala Harris is president and the United States continues to do its part to meet our climate goals, then yes, I think there are some opportunities to work with China.
I'd like to ask you about another individual who's not running for president but has aligned himself with someone who is. Elon Musk intersects a lot of these areas we're talking about when it's clean energy, EVs, which you were discussing, technology, social media. He, of course, has suggested in the past that Taiwan is an integral part of China. He has a large factory in China, and it does seem he has the ear of the former president who would like to be president again. Do you worry about the effect Elon Musk could have not just on the American election but on foreign policy?
Of course I do, but I worry about the impact that all of these billionaires have, these quasi-monopolists have. I think we have allowed for a concentration of economic and private political power in this country that is deeply anti-democratic and threatens to unwind our social and cultural order. So I'm worried about the amount of power that somebody like Elon Musk has, but I'm also worried about the amount of power that Google has and the amount of power that Amazon has. Listen, Elon Musk has done something really important for the world in bringing into the American market at scale electric vehicle technology that has the potential to help save the planet. So let's give him credit where credit is due. But he is a businessman first, second, and third. And so he is not someone that we should be listening to when it comes to national security advice, because he is going to be interested in setting U.S. policy in a way that makes him as much money as possible. And so his business relationships in places like China, in places like Russia, well, they matter to him, and to an extent they matter to the United States because we care about American businesses doing business abroad, but they should not guide foreign policy. And my worry is that Trump will be listening to Elon Musk's advice, even when that advice just is in service of making Elon Musk a couple more $1 billion in profit.
All right, Senator, I'd like to turn to the Q&A now from the audience. Again, if you have any questions in our final moments here, askac.org is where you can submit them. And just kind of starting at a high level as we have this conversation in what you described as rules-based international order. Dan Freed writes, that sounds abstract. Why should Americans care about it? What's the American national interest in it?
Yeah. Well, the United States has benefited from a post-World War II order in which broadly we do not have major state on major state conflict, right? We still have conflict in this world, but we should not take for granted the fact that for the last 70 years, we have not seen semi-regular global cataclysms of the scope of World War I and World War II. The United States has benefited, not just because there are Americans alive today because they didn't have to fight in those conflicts, but because our economy was able to sell to the world in the absence of that global conflict. Second, those markets that are available to the United States overseas are available to us because of that rules-based order, because it's not just a system of political rules, but it's a system of economic rules as well that by and large allow for a fair economic floor for American companies. There are millions of Americans who are at work today because their companies sell to the world, and they sell to the world because of a set of rules that countries live by. So if you sort of recede back into a pre-World War II environment where there are regular conflicts between large states, that comes at a cost in American lives and in American jobs. But there's a second, more existential difference between pre-World War II and post-World War II, and that's the existence of weapons of mass destruction. We used to think and worry about this a lot more in the decades after the invention of nuclear weapons, but the security that comes to us through this world order is also a security against Armageddon. And if we lose that rules-based order, and all of a sudden you have nuclear nations regularly invading neighbors, perhaps eventually coming up in conflict against another nuclear nation, well, then you could have a cataclysmic loss of life, something that we have imagined but have never had to face in reality. So that rules-based order matters more in the nuclear age, and it's worth hanging on to more tightly in an age where one mistake, one unmanaged crisis could result in millions of people dying in a heartbeat.
So it raises the question of how that case can be made to the electorate. This question comes from Ian Cameron. He's a young global professional here at the Atlantic Council. How can a future Harris administration reestablish the trust of the American electorate in American foreign policy and in the foreign policy community?
Well, it's a great question. Listen, I think there are two big mistakes of American foreign policy in the first 25 years of this century, mistakes that have to be corrected for in the second 25 years. The first we've already talked a little bit about. It's this blind faith in global neoliberal economics, the idea that unfettered, integrated global markets, including cheater nations like China, would accrue to the benefit of the U.S. economy. That didn't work. And U.S. workers are skeptical of deep economic integration with the world because they saw all their jobs leave for Mexico and China and India. So yes, they want a kind of economic nationalism in the next 25 years. They want to rebuild those industries that we lost. And if you don't show them that we care first about American workers, not first about the profits of multinational globally integrated companies, then they're not going to have much patience for an American foreign policy that ultimately is based upon trade dynamics that allow jobs to go overseas. The second big mistake of the first 25 years is this continued belief that American military power utilized overseas could address complicated political realities in far-off lands that we don't understand very well. And so I think the next administration, to gain back America's faith in the national security establishment of this country, is going to have to see restraint as a strategy. There are some times when American military power utilized overseas makes the situation worse, not better. I would argue that we have seen that repeatedly in the Middle East, from Iraq to Syria to Libya, and a stinginess about the use of American military power, certainly in places like the Middle East, I think is going to be necessary in order to show the American public that finally we have leaders that are willing to learn the lessons of the mistakes we've made.
this one comes from me, just on the American military power. Obviously, that doesn't just show itself in troops on the ground, but also distributing weapons to allies, including Israel and Ukraine. Part of the conversation, and you hear this from Senator J.D. Vance, for example, the vice presidential nominee, is this idea that there might not be enough of it to go around given the vulnerabilities within the defense industrial base. How does a future President Harris, and frankly, presidents moving forward, need to think about the defense base here in the U.S. and making sure that the U.S. is prepared not just for conflicts it itself might face, but being able to share it with allies?
So our defense industrial base is broken. It's broken. Ukraine has exposed that. It is too thin. It is too dependent on profit-based efficiency. It is not redundant enough. It's not resilient enough. And the next administration is going to have to address that liability. The Biden administration has begun that work, but Ukraine, in retrospect, maybe has the potential to appear as a small-scale conflict. There could easily be a conflict that is twice or three times the size of Ukraine, and we ran out of ammunition in a year and a half. We can't afford for that ever to happen again. So this will take a different way of thinking about the defense industrial supply base. We are badly served by having a very small number of major defense suppliers in the United States. We are going to have to broaden out the number of players. We're going to have to diversify the capacity that we have. We're going to likely have to do a lot of that with Europe. But that's critical work because this liability has been exposed. Frankly, exposed to Russia, exposed to China, and there's no doubt that they are probably thinking in the back of their brain, well, maybe we should start the next conflict, right? Maybe we should move on the Baltics. Maybe we should move on Taiwan before the United States gets its act together and is able to fix the supply chain liabilities that were exposed in Ukraine. That doesn't have to be our fate, but we're going to have to move fast, and Congress is going to have to play a role in that.
Well, and so I think that one pretty nicely fits into the challenges the next president is going to face for sure. Column, this is an anonymous question, but it kind of speaks to that idea as well. What do you think the biggest issue that President Biden hasn't been able to address in his term, the next president will need to?
No, the biggest challenge. I mean, they're all very big. But listen, I think the one we just discussed is an enormous one. Rebuilding that broken supply chain, and I think the second big one will be the fact that right now the U.S. foreign policy toolkit is arranged in a way that is pretty mismatched to the challenges that we are presented with. That'll be another big challenge for the next administration, the fact that we are spending 20 times as much money on military aid and conventional military investment as we are on smart power tools. Yes, Ukraine has shown us that conventional military invasions are still a threat to the United States and our interests. But most of the most serious threats to the United States over the next 25 years, whether it be climate change, corruption, misinformation, those big youth poverty bulges that are going to threaten stability in places like sub-Saharan Africa, those challenges can't be met with aircraft carriers or tanks or planes. You need smart power. You need economic development. You need nimble international development banks. You need anti-misinformation capacity. You need more robust humanitarian aid programs. So the second challenge I think that the next president is going to have to face is a spending allocation between the State Department, USAID, and the Department of Defense that is probably pretty badly mismatched for the set of challenges we'll face over the next quarter century.
On spending, we got a follow-up question to the conversation around the defense industrial base. How can there be a middle ground for those who support increasing defense spending and expanding the DIB, and those who support restraining our military presence in the world, like you mentioned?
Well, I think there's an easy answer to that. I mean, what we're talking about is creating a capacity to scale up in the case of a conflict. Sometimes that's a little hard to get your head wrapped around because it probably means occasionally paying for fallow capacity, for paying companies to not produce or to keep lines open, even though we may not need that ammunition today. But it does not require us to keep the level of military posture that we have in every corner of the globe. Listen, I argued early on during the Biden administration that it was time for us to reassess the level of military infrastructure that we have in the Middle East. I think people forget this, but the number of troops and the amount of basing that we have in the Middle East today is at a modern historic high. We had nothing like this infrastructure in the 1980s and the 1990s, and during that time we were able to broadly protect our interests in the region. What we have seen is that unprotected U.S. military assets in the Middle East often make us look as if we're sitting ducks for our enemies, whether it be the Houthis or other Iranian proxies. So I would argue for a reassessment of the way in which I think our military posture is probably spread far too thin around the world, especially in the Middle East. And at the same time, we could potentially use some of those savings to double down on the rebuilding of our military industrial capacity to make sure that if the United States does get in a shooting war, I hope we do not, but if we do, that we remedy the mistakes we saw laid bare in the Ukraine conflict.
You mentioned this briefly at the very beginning of your remarks, this idea that you do expect there will be a great deal of continuity between President Biden and it could be President Harris. We've got a question in from Ziviad at the Fletcher School. Do you think the Harris foreign policy will largely reflect Biden's, or do you expect any important shifts? Does she have as much skin in the game with Russia and Ukraine as Biden has?
I think it's probably dangerous for me to, make any predictions about how the Harris foreign policy will differ from the Biden foreign policy, but there will be differences, right? Kamala Harris is a different person with her own set of values. She's going to come to some different conclusions. But on the question of commitment to Ukraine or commitment to Israel, I think she's made it pretty clear that she is 100% committed to Israel's defense, to making sure that something like what happened on October 7th never, ever happens again, that Hamas is disabled as a military threat in the region, and that she is just as committed to Ukraine's sovereignty. Anybody that traveled with her or saw her speak at the last few Munich security conferences saw a powerful, personally powerful defense of Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, we all heard her comments after she met with Benjamin Netanyahu. You can certainly come to the conclusion that based upon her expressed very real concern for both the people of Israel and the innocent people of Gaza who have had their lives fundamentally altered, many of their lives taken by this conflict, that she is going to press very hard for a conclusion to this war if it is not concluded, and that she's going to be very careful about any future conflicts that involve the potential loss of tens of thousands of innocent lives. But I think the headline that you take from this transition period is that she is going to be just as committed to both Israel and Ukraine's defense as President Biden was.
All right, Senator, thank you so much. Of course, we'll hear more from the Vice President and from Donald Trump on the debate stage tomorrow. We'll see how they answer some of these same questions I asked you today when they share a stage, but it was a pleasure to share one with you today. Senator Chris Murphy, of course, the Democrat from Connecticut. I'm Kaylee Lyons here at the Atlanta Council. There will be many more conversations like this, we understand, throughout the fall as they continue these on a bipartisan basis with the run-up to the election and all of the foreign policy implications that it could have. So thank you all, those in the room and those who have joined virtually. We'll leave it there. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.